The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and he stayed close to the sea. One of the synagogue officials, named Jairus, came forward. Seeing him, he fell at Jesus' feet and pleaded earnestly with him, saying, "My daughter is at the point of death. Please come lay your hands on her, that she may get well and live." He went off with him, and a large crowd followed him. There was a woman afflicted with hemorrhages for 12 years. She had suffered greatly at the hands of many doctors and had spent all that she had, yet she was not helped, but only grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. She said, "If I but touch his clothes, I shall be cured." Immediately, her flow of blood dried up. She felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Jesus, aware at once that power had gone out from him, turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who has touched my clothes?" But his disciples said to him, "You see how the crowd is pressing upon you, and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" He looked around to see who had done it. The woman, realizing what had happened to her, approached in fear and trembling. She fell down before Jesus and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be cured of your affliction." While he was still speaking, people from the synagogue official's house arrived and said, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" Disregarding the message that was reported, Jesus said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid, just have faith." He did not allow anyone to accompany him inside except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they had arrived at the house of the synagogue official, he caught sight of a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. So he went in and said to them, "Why this commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they ridiculed him. Then he put them all out. He took along the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and entered the room where the child was. He took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." The girl, a child of 12, arose immediately and walked around. At that, they were utterly astounded. He gave strict orders that no one should know this, and said that she should be given something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. I don't watch Westerns very often, nothing against them, I just don't tend to turn to them when I'm looking for something to watch, but I do remember from my days of watching The Lone Ranger that the bad guys, so to speak, were always wearing black hats, and the Lone Ranger and those on his side would wear white hats. I think that's true for most Westerns, right? It was much easier to know the good guys from the bad guys when they wore white or black hats. Life, unfortunately, is not usually that clear. In some ways, perhaps life is a little bit more like a football game, where we might have the team that we're rooting for, but even our favorite team might not always be playing fairly, trying to see what they can get away with without the officials knowing. But even in football, there are rules, there are standards, there is right and wrong, whether we follow it or not. You can't tackle the quarterback after he's released the ball. David's story, if it tells us anything, it shows that life is not always as black and white, as clear. Even our heroes, the great King David, falls far short of God's plan for his life. And so he suffers, and so he loses his son Absalom. Absalom was hanging from a tree, powerless, unable to defend himself, much less to hurt anyone else. And yet he was struck down and killed, and it was thought a victory. David mourned. Even though Absalom had turned against him, he was still David's son. He was still a life cherished, much like the daughter of Jairus, the synagogue official, and the woman who suffered for 12 years with hemorrhages is still a precious daughter of God that Jesus cured even before he knew who it was that was seeking the cure. Jesus takes away our infirmities and bears our diseases, our gospel acclamation reminded us. Jesus comes to heal us, to be our salvation, our salve, our healing. More often, our experience of suffering and mourning is more like David's than Jairus. We don't always see miraculous cures in the lives of our loved ones, but we still turn to God with faith and trust that he knows what is best for each of God's beloved daughters and sons. Mark's gospel especially uses a gospel writing technique that takes two stories and sandwiches them together. And the middle story helps us to understand better the story on both sides of it. The woman with the hemorrhage, who had been taken advantage of by countless doctors and had run out of money and hope, did not give up hope, but placed her faith in Jesus. Jairus did as well, but lest he give up his faith and trust, when his daughter died, Jesus reminded him, "Do not be afraid, just have faith." Faith is not wishful thinking. It's not a Pollyannish view of the world where all the good guys wear white hats. But it is trust in a real God who is with us in the messiness of life, who walks with us as Jesus walked with Jairus in his mourning, and leads us to faith, to hope, and to a fuller experience of God's love that allows us to love one another.